Arturia have just increased their effects collection plugins from 15 to 22 with Arturia FX Collection 2. Let's take a look. Hi folks, I'm Mike and I hope you're well. Arturia have a marketing slogan which is audio effects you'll actually use. And it's more than a marketing slogan for me because I actually do use quite a number of their effects on a regular basis in my productions because they're high quality and they get results really quickly and they're very, very useful. Now they've expanded that collection from 15 plugins to 22 plugins with the new Effects Collection 2. In this video, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the new plugins to the collection, but I will quickly go through all of them towards the end. So let's get started with 3 new bus effects. So the 3 latest members of the Effects Collection family are these 3 bus effects that you can see on the screen here. Now these could conceivably be used on individual tracks. However, they're really designed to be used on buses where you've got a number of tracks being blended together into one. And of course, one of those buses could be the master bus. So you'd be applying it to the whole song or the whole piece of music. Now let's take a look at the first one of these, which is an EQ. This is the EQ Citrel 295, based upon an old piece of hardware from the 1970s. I think it was a Siemens Citrel, and I think the original model number might have been the W295. Now, it looks not exactly like that original piece of hardware, but somewhat inspired by it. And this brings me on to something which is sort of fairly common amongst Arturia effects. They'll give you at least the bare minimum of control that the original hardware had, but they'll always give you something, or almost always give you something extra. Okay, now one of the big extras on this particular occasion is something called the visualizer. If I go to the top right here, I'll switch it on. This was not on the original piece of hardware, and it gives us a visual representation of what's going on. So before I just tell you what all these controls are about, let's just play the music that this is applied to. This is a drum bus and it sounds like this. And you can see that happening in the visualizer up there. Now let's go through these controls. There's a few of them, but they're really quite simple once you understand how they work. We've got 2 rows here and they are identical. They are just for the left and right channels. Okay, if you insert this plugin into a mono channel, it will know that and you'll just have a mono representation or a mono version of the interface. But this is a stereo bus. Now we can either have them linked together so that they work in unison with each other, or we can actually unlink them, which I'll do now, and we can control the left and the right side individually. You can see them represented in the lines up here by the yellow and the orange line. So the thing about a bus EQ is that it's generally going to be used for broad sort of sweeps. It's not going to have this sort of surgical nature to it where you're going in, pinpointing specific frequencies and raising or lowering them. This is about sort of broad sweeps, a very sort of musical way to use your EQ to craft or sculpt a sound. Okay, and this is really kind of what I would describe as a 3-band EQ with a high and a low pass filter. Let's go through them now. So the first one down here is the high pass filter, and you can see I'm moving it around there, just selecting the frequency, and that's the only control you really have over it, is selecting the frequency. Okay, so very straightforward to use in that way. The next thing that we have up here is a low shelf, so you can see that operating there. That's going to be handy for boosting some low frequencies. Now we can assign it to be sort of working around 3 separate frequencies 50, 100 and 300 there. Okay, so we've got sort of a switch for that there. So if we wanted to sort of make the low end stand out, we would be using that there. Let's have a listen. Okay, then moving on, we're going to be dealing with sort of middle frequencies here. This one, I'll just push this up a bit, is a bell curve, and it's set up the high end there, but we can move it down through frequencies in the sort of middle like so. So I may use it to sort of focus around about where, say, the snare is around here and bring that out. Let's have a listen. and so on and so forth. You can see how that works there. Then we move on to a high shelf. Okay, you can see that working there if we wanted to bring the top end up. Again, we can change which frequencies this is working out there. And then finally, we have a low pass. Okay, and we can use that like so there. That's the basic controls of this particular plugin. There's a switch here where you can change between two different sort of flavors or characters there, and a few other minor controls there. But that's an overview of how that works. Really, really handy if you just want to sculpt a sound, especially on something like I was doing there on a whole drum kit. Very handy indeed. Now, the next thing that we're moving on to is a compressor. Okay, this is called the Comp Diode 609. It's based on an old Neve compressor, and it looks sort of fairly similar to it in a way. It's got very similar controls, but it has, of course, got a little extra, which we'll talk about in a moment. But what are the main controls? Well, we have our threshold control, which works by bringing it down. Okay, so it starts up high, so it's doing nothing, and then we can bring it down like so. Okay, that's probably very much over compressed. Then we have an attack control here. This one's called recovery. I think of this as a release control. Okay, then makeup gain, so that we can actually recover our gain if we've reduced it with the threshold, and then a ratio here as well. Now, as well as a compressor, we also have a limiter as well. Works in a very simple way. We just adjust the threshold and then the release, and we've just got a fast or slow attack. Now, what's really handy about this, in my opinion, is I often like to use compressors and limiters together for parallel compression. So I may well use this in the future for that. I haven't had enough time to fully try it out yet and see what I really like it on, but that would be my thought on this, especially for something like this, for drums. If I want to use this for parallel compression and limiting, could be very handy indeed. Now, what about the extras? Well, if we click on the advanced button at the top here, you can see it reveals a panel down here. I don't think this was on there or a feature of the original, and this is a sidechain compressor. So the idea of a sidechain compressor is normally so that we can use the source from another track or another bus or what have you to trigger this compressor. Okay, so we no longer would be using, say, the drums in this case to trigger the compression. We may, say, be using, I don't know, bass or some other part of our composition to trigger this compressor. This is really handy for what we call ducking, where we sort of want to lower our signal, lower the level so that we can reveal other parts in our piece of music. So very, very handy that it's got that in there, and that's also something I may well be using in the future with this particular plugin. Now let's move on to my third and favorite plugin with these new ones. This is called Bus Force, a very interesting plugin indeed. This is a parallel processor. We'll talk about exactly what that means in a moment, but let's first of all look at the processor part of it, or the four different types of processing we've got involved. They are down the bottom here. We have an equalizer, we have a filter, which is a low and high pass filter, we have a compressor, and we also have some saturation. Now, the next thing I want to explain about this plugin is this area here where we have this visualization again here. Now, if we use the control, say, in the EQ here, you can see that's giving us that representation of what we're doing there. So again, I'll just use this to boost the mids. Can see that happening there. So okay, there's a random sort of change I've made there. Now when we click on some other control in a different section, say in the filter section, this changes now to only display what's happening in the filter section. So I could use my high pass there, my low pass there, very straightforward. Now when we go on to use the compressor, for example, you'll see things change to very much compression type controls. Let's play the drums here, and we'll bring this threshold down, see what happens. Some pretty heavy compression there again. Okay, so you can see that that's a really great way to sort of see what's going on with your controls over here. And finally, when we go to the saturation controls over here, again, we can make changes and see the effects over there. So that's the first thing to remember. Now this display will change again when we start to look at the parallel part of this. This is where it gets really, really interesting, and it's kind of what the main purpose of this processor is. If I click on one of these, what I'm going to call mixing buttons up here, or mixer buttons, these are for different paths: dry path, compressor path, saturation path. When I click on this, you'll start to see what's happening in terms of parallel processing, okay, because it's giving a visual representation here of what's going on. So if you don't know, parallel processing is where we take a signal, we split it, and then we it's an identical signal at that point, but then we apply effects to one part and not the other, or maybe different effects to each part. We then blend them back together into one, okay? Now, this is very, very useful, especially for parallel compression that I was talking about earlier. It's something I really like to use it for, but it could be used for other things as well. So we can see the paths here. We start in at the beginning here with the signal. It then splits here, and it goes up here to a completely dry path, which is muted at the moment, but we can switch it off, and then we can change the level of that dry path up there. Now where it's split back here, it then went on up here through this EQ, through this filter, through this compressor. So that's why this is the sort of compressor path. And just before it gets to the end and goes to the output here, again, we'll unmute it, it splits again and goes through this saturation path. So with this parallel compressor, we've actually got 3 different paths, which then come back together and then go to the main output. And then the idea is that you can do some processing and then blend those different paths together, okay? Now, we can change the routing a little bit here on this one as well. So for example, if we click on this EQ button here, or equalizer button, you can see it's changed it here. Now, don't get confused by what's happening here. We haven't sort of only applied EQ to the dry path. It started here, it's EQ'd first before it splits, okay? So it has EQ'd both the dry path and the compressor path, and then finally the saturation path as well, okay? So let's change where the EQ is. You can also change the routing in terms of the compressor, I believe. So here we have the compressor coming after this split before it goes to the saturation. So that means the saturation and the compressor both receive EQ and filter, and then we split off. The saturation doesn't receive the compressed signal, okay? So we can also change where the filter is as well, likewise. So very, very flexible in terms of sort of routing those things. And if you haven't used parallel processing at all, then I'd strongly encourage you to do it, because it's not really that complex. Maybe it looks a little bit more complex here than it really is, but it's, in my opinion, it's kind of easy to get really great results, especially from a beginner's perspective, because you're always maintaining your original signal, that dry signal, and you're just blending in those other changes. It's subtle, but can be very effective indeed. And that's our 3 bus effects. Oh, by the way, are you finding this video useful? If you are, go ahead and hit the like button for me. Do it right away so that you don't forget. If you don't like this video, make sure you hit the dislike button twice. And if you do like this kind of content, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube so that you're notified about my other videos. Now back to this video. Now the next 4 effects added to this collection are 4 modulation effects. Now I must stress they've been added to this collection, but they're not brand new plugins. These have previously been available from Arturia, and in fact I've already made a video about these where I've covered them in a lot more depth than I'll be doing now. So if you want to get some more depth on these, watch the rest of this video first and then follow the link in the description or at the end of this video to get these, as I say, in more depth. Now I'm going to be applying all 4 of them to this guitar track, which I'll play to you now. Now that's in fact 2 guitars, one in the left speaker, one in the right speaker. They're going through a bus, and then I'm applying these to that bus. Let's start off with this chorus here, the chorus dimension D. This is based upon an old effect from Roland, iconic, and it's no wonder because it sounds great, and it's got very few controls, so it's really easy to use. So let's apply it to that guitar now. As I say, simple to use. You've just got these 3 basic modes, and then you've got the 4th button here, which just adds a bit more wet signal to those 3 modes. And of course, Arturia always over delivers, so they've got this advanced section where you can change things like the oscillator shape, or change some saturation settings, change the width, etc. So that's an awesome effect, easy to use. You have it up and running in seconds, and it produces a great result every time. But the next chorus that I'm going to show you is actually my favorite of these 2. I really love this. This is based upon the chorus section of the Roland Juno 6 synthesizer. As I said, it's based upon, it's not exactly the same. I'm just playing you the basic setting with nothing changed at all. Let's have a listen to it now. Oh, it's just so rich. It's got so much depth. I really just love that effect very much indeed. Moving on from there, though, let's go on to a flanger, the forgotten effect. Well, unless you can remember the 70s and 80s, I guess. But this is a great effect. I wish it would have a bit of a comeback, personally. Let's apply it again to that guitar with just the basic settings. Nothing much done to it. Have a listen. And I'm not going to go through all of the settings, but I will point out that, again, there's an advanced section where we can manually, change what's going on with the flanger envelope, whatever you want to say. So, you can apply that into these settings up here. So lots to play around with there to really tailor the flanger sound that you want. Moving on from there, we then move on finally to a phaser. Again, an interesting effect, similar to the others, but quite different in other ways under the hood. And I'm just going to mess around with this foot pedal here while I play the guitar part. That's going to change the rate. I better switch that over to pedal, and I'll do that now. Let's have a listen. There's a lot to this. This is a sort of a dual phaser happening here, phaser A and phaser B, as you can see here. Again, an advanced mode which reveals a few more controls under the hood here. Really worth exploring, really worth messing around with if you want that sort of effect. Let's move on to the other effects. So all of the effects that you're going to see for the rest of this video were in the previous version of the effects collection. They may have improved or tweaked them in some way, but they were essentially there. And I have covered that in another video, which I'm going to link in the description down below and at the end of this video if you want to see them in more depth, because I'm really going to whiz through them now to save time. I'm going to start off with these 3. These are 3 reverb effects. And this is one of my favorite sections of the whole collection. Let's start off with this one. This is a spring reverb. Now, this is not an effect that I use an awful lot, but when I do use it, I like to sometimes use it on electric guitar. So let's just have a listen to this now on the electric guitar that we were listening to earlier. Lots and lots to play with here. Again, there's an advanced section where we've got things like pre-filters, post-equalizer, all good stuff like that. So lots and lots to adapt, to enable you to adapt this spring reverb. It somewhat sounds like the sort of reverb that you would often get on a guitar amplifier, but you can use it with other things as well, of course. Moving on quickly, we then go on to this plate reverb. Now, I've got this one applied to the acoustic guitar in this track that I'm working on, and it sounds like this. Now you've got a few different options in this. You can drive it hard to add saturation, that kind of stuff. You can change the decay time, as you can see there, but we do have an advanced section as well where we can change things like filters, equalizers, pre-delay, all that kind of good stuff. So lots of options there if you like that plate reverb sound. I really like it because it's really nice. I like the way the decay works on this particular one. It doesn't hang in there too long. It's got a nice drop off to it. Now, finally, we're going to move on to what I think is probably my absolutely favorite plugin from this whole collection, and this is Rev Intensity. I've used it on many tracks since I started using it last year. It's replaced some of the old reverbs that I used to use. Something about it just works for me very quickly, especially on vocals. Now, I've got it sort of plastered on fairly thick on the vocal on this track, a little bit unapologetically, because in the context of the whole track it works. But I'm going to play it now on this female vocal. Let's have a listen.
Of all the things we could have known, of all the ways we could have grown.
I mean, that's sort of huge. Obviously you can adjust it to all different kinds of reverbs, but I just love the quality of this particular reverb. If we click on advanced, we can see that there's many different ways that you can control this, including sort of adding modulation, pre-filters, post-filters. Really sort of adaptable in its nature in many different ways. Definitely, I'm going to say, my favorite plugin of the whole collection. Now, 2 of the 3 plugins that you can see on the screen right now are some of my most used plugins in my productions for about the last year or so. They're all preamps, and I really like to use them on vocals and guitar right at the beginning of a chain. But like I say, 2 of them get used a lot more than the other one, and that's these 2 here, the pre-1973 and the pre-Tried A. I generally like to use these on male and female vocals, and as I say, right at the beginning of the chain. Now, I've got them applied to this current song that I'm going to play in a moment, where the female vocal is taking a phrase and then the male vocal. I'm going to start off with them switched off, their bypass, so you won't see the needle or anything moving, and then I'll switch them on, see if you can hear the difference once they're engaged.
You should have helped me from the start.
I never thought I'd need to.
And never let us drift apart.
I never thought I'd miss you. We could have talked, we could have learned.
Now, hopefully you would have heard quite a difference there. Now, that a lot of that is happening because there's some EQ changes, and that's my primary sort of functional use of these plugins. They've both got EQs on them, which work in a slightly different way to each other, and that may be where I'll use one over the other, depending on what I'm wanting to get from the initial sound of that track. Now, they also do add some sort of character to it. It's subtle, but it does add that sort of slight vintage sort of flavor if you drive these hard like I have done here. Now, moving on to the third of these plugins, we also have this Pre-V76. I don't use this quite as often, but I can show you an example here where I'm using it on some harmony vocals a little bit later on in the same song. Again, I'm largely using it for a little bit of a lift in the EQ in the high end on this. Now, this is a big reason why I'll use these plugins. If I need to do some EQing, if I can do fairly broad sweeps and I'm not doing anything too sort of clinical or surgical, then I like to use these because then you do get that added benefit of a little bit of character to the sound. So there are 3 compressors in the effects collection, and I've used them all across this song, but I'm going to focus on where I've used them here on the piano and the female vocal. Starting off with the piano, I've used this one, the VCA65. Now, the piano plays a lot harder in the chorus section here, so I'm primarily using it there to just keep control of it, especially the transients where it plays a lot heavier in the low end in this section of the song. I'll play the piano and you'll see and hear what it's doing. Now, you can see that there's a couple of places where things are being indicated. Over here, that we've got the needle, or the meter, which indicates the amount of gain reduction which is happening. We've also got these lights over here. These indicate where the threshold is being met or it's going above the threshold. Now, when you first open this plugin, the compression will be turned all the way down. The threshold will be up, and you'll need to drag it down until your source reaches the threshold. Those lights will start flashing, but you won't hear any difference. What you need to do is make sure you push the compression knob up. I think this may be acting a little bit like a ratio control that you see on other compressors. Not absolutely certain, but I think that's the way it's working. Now, attack and release are there, which makes it very useful for things like this, and also there's a limiter included. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now let's move on to the female vocals. For the female vocals, I have this compressor, the Comp Tube STA. Now this I'm using instead of what I would normally use, an LA2A style compressor. And if you want an alternative to that, this is a good choice. They're not the same. It definitely is an alternative in character and the way it works. However, like I say, if you want to try something different, definitely give this one a go. I'm using it here just very subtly to knock off 2 or 3 dB from the female vocal as it gets a little bit out of control. Let's have a listen.
You should have helped me from the start.
I never thought I'd need to.
And never let us drift.
Now, in order to keep that female vocal present throughout the song, I've also done some parallel compression. And for that, I've used this, probably the most recognizable of all these compressors, because it's based on the sort of famous 1176. Now, I don't normally use 1176s on the vocal track itself. I prefer different compressors for that. But it is very useful in situations like this, in parallel compression, where I really want to compress very, very hard, very extreme, and then blend it in with the original track. And you'll see that happening there. When I play the track again, you'll see it absolutely kind of slamming those female vocals. And then I've gently blended it in to keep the vocal nice and present.
You should have helped me from the start.
I never thought I'd need to.
And never let us drift apart.
Now, I went for this plugin on this occasion. I also could have used the first one, the VCA65, for the same purpose. May have been more useful because it's got the limiter on there as well. It's nice to combine those two sometimes for sidechain compression. But on this occasion, I felt that the FET76 was really doing the job for me in a really nice way. So if it's delays that you're after, we have 3 in this collection. I'm applying them all to the electric guitar here. I'm going to whiz through really, really quickly, folks. As I say, check out some with these with some more detail in my other video linked in the description. Let's start off with the first one here, which is Delay Eternity. Lots and lots of control with this particular delay. I'm just going to play you with one setting here, the electric guitar sounding like this. Using a nice dual delay there, can be used in mono mode, different stereo modes, all that good stuff. It's got filters on there. Lots and lots of controls, even an advanced panel here with even more controls. That's all you get for now from this. Moving on from that, the next one that I want to show you is called Memory Brigade. Now, with this one, I'm not so much going to focus on the delay features, but one nice thing about it is, I mean, it's got simple delay features, which are very effective, but one nice thing is this chorus and vibrato effect that you have built into it as well. I've got the chorus switched on full here. Let's have a listen. Just love what it's done to the sound of that guitar there. Much more gritty sounding, very sort of retro. So that's another one on there. And probably my favorite of these 3 is the Tape 201, this delay here, which is obviously based on a very sort of classic and recognizable piece of equipment. Now, this one to me is probably my favorite, especially on this track, because it's just so smooth sounding, so organic sounding. Let's have a listen. Love it, love it, love it. Let's move on. So finally, we have 3 filters included. Now, I do not make use of filters very often. I'm definitely not an expert on these, and I've only rarely used them, but I will demonstrate them to you here. If you play different styles of music to me, you may use these a lot more often. Or if you're just looking for a really sort of extreme effect at times, these could be really, really useful. Let's start off with the first one of them, which is the M12 filter here. This is going to give you a good idea of what filters actually do. I'm going to run through some presets. Before I do, though, I'll just play the drums that I'm applying them to quickly so you know how they sound without filters. Okay, you've got that. So let's switch this on. We'll listen to Distant Land. Now, this is what I'm going to call a fairly static filter. There's not any movement in it. Have a listen. So you can hear that it's filtered out some frequencies here, but we can make that move over time. I'll move on to another preset. This is called Fat Puncher, much more extreme. And because the tempo of this, or the rate of this, I should say, is synced to the tempo of the song, it's going to sound sort of fairly musical in its outcome. Let's have a listen. So that gives you a good idea of what can be done. Moving on to the last one, this is called Frog Whistle. So you can hear what's happening there. We're filtering out some frequencies, and then we're, as I say, I call it animating the results, okay, using a lot of envelopes in this particular one. Now, moving on to the next one, I'll just switch this one off. This one's called Filter Mini. Not so much of a sort of a nice GUI on this one, lots of knobs, but you'll get an idea how it works in a moment when I just play this one. Annoying Neighbors, this is called. Again, that's another one without much movement. We've completely suppressed the top end there. Moving on to another preset, just an env follower, probably an envelope follower. I'm guessing that means you can already see that these step sequencer lights have lit up. Let's have a listen and see what's happening. And moving on from there, we have this one's called Ballad. So you can get some pretty extreme effects with these filters. We'll move on to the final one here, which is called Filter SEM or SEM. This one, again, I'll go through some of the presets. Starting off with this one's called Afro. This one's called Bass Boost. And this one's BP Run. So a lot of fun can be had with filters, and if you're just looking to create that very sort of special effect in your track, then this would be a great place to start. Now, Arturia sent me these plugins to try out before the release date. So at the time of making this video, I don't have final prices for you. Follow the link in the description as soon as it's available, which will probably be within a few hours of me releasing this video, to find out what the final pricing is. Also, make sure you follow the links in the description to get more depth on some of the plugins which I covered in previous videos. Leave comments down below. Tell me what are your favorite plugins in this collection, and is it something that you're going to have your eye on? Love to hear from you about that. Also, check the link in the description for my patreon.com, where for as little as $1 per month, you can help me help you by making more videos like this. And I'll see you in the next video.